Good evening, and welcome to the Sleepless Library. Tonight's episode explores the Department of Justice's investigation into one of the most scrutinized custodial deaths in recent memory, the case of Jeffrey Epstein. This official report reveals how a cascade of institutional failures allowed a high-profile inmate to die in federal custody, raising urgent questions about accountability, oversight, and the state of the prison system itself. Before we begin, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Now settle in, dim the lights, and allow your thoughts to slow as we carefully walk through the investigation. The Department of Justice Inspector General, OIG, investigated how Jeffrey Epstein, a high-profile pretrial detainee facing federal sex trafficking charges, was able to die by apparent unalive while in federal custody. On the morning of August 10, 2019, Epstein was found hanged in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center MCC in New York. He had recently been moved off unalive watch, which he was placed on after an apparent attempt to hang himself in late July, yet was left with the means and opportunity to carry out another unalive just 2 weeks later. The New York City Chief Medical Examiner ruled his death unalive, and an FBI inquiry found no evidence of foul play in his death. With foul play ruled out, the OIG's review uncovered numerous breaches of duty and protocol by Bureau of Prison staff that created the conditions for Epstein's death. Despite the Bureau of Prison's mission of providing safe and secure custody, Epstein's detention at MCC was marked by egregious lapses. During his time in the facility's Special Housing Unit, SHU, a segregated high-security wing, basic safeguards were ignored. The night before his death, Epstein's cellmate was transferred out, yet staff failed to assign a new cellmate despite a directive that he not be left alone due to his recent unalive attempt. Officers on duty also did not perform the required inmate counts or overnight rounds in the SHU, and they allowed Epstein to accumulate an excessive number of bed linens in his cell. These lapses meant Epstein was isolated and unmonitored for hours, giving him the opportunity to take his own life without intervention. Investigators found that a supervisor had improperly permitted Epstein to make an unrecorded, unmonitored phone call on the evening of August 9th, a call that violated policy, and that 2 days earlier Epstein had even signed a new will in a private legal meeting, something MCC staff only discovered after his death. Furthermore, the two employees guarding Epstein's unit that night falsified log entries to cover up the fact that they had not been doing their rounds or inmate counts as required. The OIG concluded that Epstein's unalive was not a random act of fate, but the tragic culmination of long-standing systemic failures within the federal jail. Many of the lapses mirrored chronic problems the OIG has identified in the Bureau of Prisons for years, including acute staffing shortages, inadequate monitoring of at-risk inmates, malfunctioning security cameras, and widespread disregard for protocols. In Epstein's case, the combination of negligence, misconduct, and outright failure to follow procedure created an environment in which one of the Bureau's most notorious inmates was able to end his own life in custody. This outcome not only represented a fundamental breach of the government's duty to safely keep those in its charge, but it also led to widespread questions about the circumstances of Epstein's death, while effectively depriving his numerous victims of the opportunity to seek justice in court. For the OIG, Epstein's case became a dramatic example of the very problems it had long warned about, adding urgency to the need for BOP leadership to finally implement lasting reforms. Investigation overview and key findings. In its opening section, the OIG report recounts the discovery of Epstein's death and summarizes the major failures that allowed it to happen. Early on August 10, 2019, MCC New York staff found Epstein unresponsive, hanging by a bedsheet in his SHU cell. He was rushed to a hospital where he was pronounced dead. An autopsy later confirmed that Epstein died by unalive and not by foul play. The OIG immediately began investigating how such a high-profile inmate could have been left in a position to take his own life. They soon identified numerous and serious lapses by MCC New York personnel. For example, the 2 correctional officers on duty the night of Epstein's death failed to conduct any of the required inmate counts or 30-minute rounds in the SU for approximately 8 hours, leaving Epstein completely unchecked through the night. Those officers, Tova Noel and Michael Thomas, instead falsified the official logs to make it appear as if they had been performing their duties, entries that subsequent investigation proved were false. Compounding the negligence, Epstein's cellmate had been transferred out on August 9th, and no replacement was assigned, despite explicit instructions that Epstein should never be left alone after his previous unalive attempt. This meant that, from the evening of August 9th until the morning of August 10th, Epstein was housed alone in his cell with no one to alert staff in an emergency, and with an alarming surplus of linens in the cell that he was inexplicably allowed to amass. The OIG notes that all these failures directly compromised Epstein's safety and provided the window for him to end his life unobserved. The introduction section also highlights other irregularities in Epstein's final days. Just hours before his death, a supervisor improperly let Epstein make a telephone call that was neither recorded nor monitored. Purportedly to speak with a family member, in reality he spoke to a personal associate, which violated BOP policy. 2 days prior, during a legal visit on August 8th, Epstein had quietly signed a new will, a significant act that went unnoticed by jail staff until after his demise. These incidents underscored the lax oversight and rule-breaking that pervaded Epstein's custody. Despite the rampant violations of procedure, the OIG found no indication of foul play in Epstein's death. Every MCC staff member interviewed denied any knowledge suggesting a homicide, and none of the 15 inmates interviewed, including those housed near Epstein, provided credible information to contradict the conclusion of unalive. In fact, 3 inmates whose cells faced Epstein's cell told investigators that no one entered or exited Epstein's cell after guards locked him in for the night of August 9th, consistent with the facility's security measures that kept all inmates secured in their cells. Due to the failure of the camera recording system, there was no video from inside the tier that night. However, the available footage from a common area camera showed no unknown persons or suspicious activity in the vicinity during the overnight hours. Moreover, the New York City Medical Examiner reported that Epstein's injuries were characteristic of a self-inflicted hanging and showed none of the wounds or bruising that would suggest a struggle, supporting the finding of unalive. In sum, the report's introductory chapter concludes that Epstein's death was the result of a cascading series of job performance failures, misconduct, and managerial deficiencies at MCC New York. While Epstein alone carried out the final act, the environment created by the staff's actions and inaction made it possible. The OIG emphasizes that these kinds of failures were not unique to this case, but reflected broader institutional problems that the BOP had long failed to address. This set the stage for the detailed findings in the subsequent chapters of the report, which delve into the specific breakdowns in procedure and oversight that led to Epstein's death. The report's background section provides context about Epstein's case and the jail environment in which he was held. Epstein was a wealthy financier indicted in July 2019 on federal charges of sex trafficking minors in the early 2000s. Arrested on July 6, 2019, after returning from overseas, he was transported to MCC New York, a federal detention center in Manhattan, while awaiting trial. MCC New York primarily housed pretrial detainees and was known for its aging infrastructure and overcrowded conditions. In fact, the facility would later be closed in 2021 due to substandard conditions, unrelated to this case. Because of Epstein's notoriety and the intense media attention surrounding him, officials removed him from the general inmate population just one day after his arrival, and placed him in the special housing unit for his own safety. The SU is a housing unit within the jail where inmates are securely separated from the general population and kept locked in their cells for approximately 23 hours a day, to ensure their own safety as well as the safety of staff and other inmates. MCC New York was severely understaffed during Epstein's detention, a factor that figured prominently in the security lapses that occurred. Notably, the two employees tasked with guarding Epstein's SHU unit on the night he died were a regular correctional officer, Tova Noel, who was working a double shift, and a junior employee, Michael Thomas, whose normal job was as a warehouse materials handler, but who was pulled in on overtime to cover the officer shortage. Both guards were later found to have spent the night of August 9th to 10th neglecting their duties and falsifying records, and they were criminally charged with conspiracy and federal record falsification for lying about the inmate checks they failed to do. In 2019, Noel and Thomas were indicted. In 2021, they entered into deferred prosecution agreements admitting their misconduct, completed community service, and avoided trial, after which the charges against them were dismissed. Prosecutors also determined that other MCC staff had falsified logs on the day before and day of Epstein's death, though those individuals were not criminally charged. The OIG found that beyond those two officers, numerous MCC employees showed a pattern of poor judgment and failure to follow procedures in Epstein's case. To uncover the full picture, OIG investigators conducted a comprehensive inquiry. They interviewed 54 witnesses, including the MCC warden, associate wardens, supervisors, correctional staff such as Noel and Thomas, medical personnel and contractors responsible for the jail's security camera system. The OIG also spoke with 15 inmates who were at MCC during the relevant period, including 3 who were housed in the SEHU tier directly across from Epstein's cell, to gather any observations about Epstein's behavior and the events surrounding his death. Investigators collected and reviewed more than 127,000 documents and pieces of evidence, ranging from staff shift logs, inmate count sheets, and housing assignment records to Epstein's medical and psychological files, phone and visitor logs, internal emails and texts, and surveillance video footage. They performed forensic analyses on MCC computer systems and even examined Epstein's autopsy report, interviewing the medical examiner for her insights into the cause of death. Together, this evidence provided an exhaustive record of Epstein's time in custody and the circumstances leading up to his death. The background section of the report also outlines the rules and procedures that should have governed Epstein's confinement. BOP policy mandates strict monitoring for inmates in the SU. Correctional staff are required to observe each SU inmate at least twice per hour, in 30-minute intervals. Lieutenants must make a supervisory round of the unit once per shift, and official head counts of inmates must be conducted multiple times daily. These measures exist to ensure inmates' safety and security, and to give staff regular opportunities to detect any problems, such as a medical emergency or rule violation. Further, MCC's local procedures called for frequent cell searches, at least 5 cells per day in the SHU, and weekly searches of the entire SHU to eliminate safety hazards like excess bedding or contraband. In Epstein's case, the presence of extra sheets in his cell on the morning of August 10th indicated that these preventative measures were not rigorously enforced. The BAP's Unalive Prevention Program guidelines were also critical background. Under federal regulations, any inmate identified as actively unalive must be placed on around-the-clock unalive watch until the imminent risk has passed. Unalive watch may only be lifted once a psychologist determines the danger is abated. At MCC New York, after coming off unalive watch, inmates could be kept on psychological observation, which is similar to unalive watch but slightly less restrictive. The inmate could wear regular clothes and have limited personal items while still being closely monitored by staff. After Epstein's first apparent unalive attempt on July 23rd, jail psychologists explicitly recommended, in writing, that he never be left alone in a cell and that he always have a cellmate as a precaution. The background makes clear that falsifying prison records and failing to perform mandated duties are serious violations of both policy and law. Federal standards of conduct require employees to use their official time conscientiously, and lying on count sheets or round logs can constitute a federal crime, as evidenced by the charges brought against Epstein's guards. This section sets the stage by showing that Epstein's high-profile status, known unalive risk, an under-resourced jail, and multiple ignored procedures all converged, creating an environment rife for the calamity that would occur. Timeline of key events. Epstein's detention at MCC New York lasted just over a month, from early July until his death in August 2019. He was arrested on July 6, 2019, and because of his notoriety and the publicity of his case, officials quickly moved him into the facility's Special Housing Unit, SHU, for high-security inmates. In mid-July, after routine intake screenings and psychological evaluations, Epstein was deemed not actively unalive. He denied any unalive ideation, and showed protective factors like future-oriented thinking, and he was housed in the SHU with a cellmate under close observation. On July 18th, a judge denied Epstein's request for bail, ordering that he remain detained pending trial because he presented a danger to the community and a flight risk. Epstein met frequently with his attorneys in a private meeting room, often for many hours at a time, as he prepared his defense. During one such session on July 16th, he even joked with his lawyers about the unalive precautions being taken and insisted that he had no intention of harming himself. Everything changed in the early morning hours of July 23, 2019. At about 1:27 a.m., a nearby guard heard commotion coming from Epstein's SHU cell. Epstein's cellmate, identified in the report as Inmate 1, shouted for help, and when officers arrived they found Epstein on the floor of his cell with a strip of orange bedsheet wrapped around his neck. Epstein was still alive and semi-conscious, with visible red marks on his neck and an abrasion on one knee. Responding staff immediately called a medical emergency and moved Epstein to the prison's health unit, suspecting an unalive attempt. Notably, Epstein's accounts of what happened shifted over time. At first he claimed that his cellmate had tried to kill him, but the cellmate told officials that Epstein had strangled himself with a noose, and he, the cellmate, had intervened by calling for help. Another inmate on the tier later corroborated that the cellmate had shouted for guards upon discovering Epstein's actions. Confronted with conflicting stories and an inmate with injuries, MCC officials took no chances. They placed Epstein on unalive watch immediately, under constant observation by specially trained staff in the medical wing of the facility. Epstein remained on unalive watch for about 24 hours. By the morning of July 24th, he'd been transferred off the watch and into a step-down regime called psychological observation, where he was still housed in the infirmary area and checked regularly by mental health professionals. During a post-watch interview that day, Epstein recanted his earlier insinuation of an attack. He told a psychologist that he actually couldn't recall what had happened in his cell or how he ended up on the floor with a neck injury. For the next 6 days, from July 24th up until July 30th, Epstein was kept under close monitoring in the medical unit. Each day, psychological staff met with him to evaluate his risk. Epstein consistently denied having any unalive thoughts or plans during this period, and often stated that he couldn't remember the incident on July 23rd. Gradually, the consensus among the clinicians was that Epstein could be returned to a more normal custodial setting. On July 30th, 2019, MCC officials moved Epstein back from the infirmary to the SHU, after determining that his risk of self-harm appeared to have abated. Recognizing the need for extra caution, the prison's chief psychologist had sent an email to staff on July 30th, explicitly directing that Epstein needs to be housed with an appropriate cellmate at all times. Accordingly, that day Epstein was given a new cellmate, identified as Inmate 3, in the SHU, and they were placed in a cell that could accommodate Epstein's CPAP machine for his sleep apnea. Around this time, the jail also initiated internal disciplinary proceedings against Epstein for the alleged self-injury incident on July 23rd, essentially treating his possible unalive attempt as a misconduct violation. However, the hearing on that charge ultimately found insufficient evidence that Epstein had willfully harmed himself, and no punishment was imposed. When questioned during the disciplinary process, Epstein once again said he had no memory of the event that left marks on his neck. In early August 2019, Epstein continued to be managed as a high-profile inmate, albeit one whom mental health staff now assessed as not actively unalive. On August 1st, MCC staff noted a mention of unalive tendencies in Epstein's jail file, stemming from paperwork provided by the US Marshals, and responded by having a psychologist perform a fresh unalive risk evaluation. During this follow-up on August 1st, Epstein again denied having any unalive ideation. No formal watch was deemed necessary at that time, though clinicians planned to keep a close eye on him. On August 2nd, the facility's Special Investigative Services Unit completed its investigation of the July 23rd incident. Their inquiry found insufficient evidence to conclude whether Epstein's neck injuries were self-inflicted or the result of an assault by his cellmate, leaving the question officially unresolved. In the week that followed, Epstein's routine seemed to stabilize. He continued to have almost daily visits from his attorneys and showed no outward signs of despondency or self-harm. In fact, during an August 8th psychology session, just 2 days before his death, Epstein once more denied having any unalive thoughts, plans, or impulses. However, beneath this appearance of normalcy, several developments were unfolding that would prove critical. On that same day, August 8th, Epstein took the unexpected step of signing a new last will and testament, reportedly during a meeting with his lawyers, an event that jail staff were unaware of at the time. Additionally, MCC New York staff discovered on August 8th that a major technical malfunction had occurred in the facility's security camera system. A hardware failure back on July 29th had knocked out the recording capability for about half of the prison's cameras, including those in the SU, and nobody had noticed the problem for over a week. Although replacement parts were on hand, the repair had not been completed by the end of that day. August 9th, 2019 was Epstein's last day alive, and it began like any other. In the morning, his cellmate was transferred out of the SHU to a different facility, a move that staff knew was coming. Per the psychology department's directive, Epstein should not have been left alone, yet no replacement cellmate was assigned to him after this transfer. 2 officers later claimed they informed a supervisor that Epstein needed a cellmate, but no action was taken. Epstein spent several hours that day meeting with his attorneys in the SHU attorney-client conference room. Shortly before 1 p.m. during that meeting, Epstein's lawyers asked jail officials if Epstein could be moved out of the SHU to a safer or more comfortable location, or at least be allowed to have no cellmate in his current cell. This request, perhaps intended to improve Epstein's jail conditions, ran directly counter to the precautionary order that he always have a roommate, and it was not granted. That same day, a significant development in Epstein's legal circumstances was making headlines outside the prison. The Second Circuit Court of Appeals released approximately 2,000 pages of documents from a prior civil case related to Epstein, which contained graphic allegations against him and others. The media coverage of these unsealed files was widespread on August 9th, potentially heightening Epstein's stress as he learned of the news. His marathon meeting with his attorneys continued until about 6:45 p.m. that evening, when Epstein was escorted back to his SHU cell after the lawyers departed. Upon his return, one of the last special accommodations was made for Epstein, and it would prove to be another breach of protocol. Around 7 p.m. on the night of August 9th, a unit manager at MCC New York approved Epstein's request to place a telephone call to his family. Normally, inmate phone calls, other than legal calls, are recorded and monitored, especially for someone in the SHU. In this instance, staff set Epstein up on an unrecorded line and did not monitor the call in violation of BOP policy. Epstein told them he was calling his mother, an implausible story since his mother was long deceased. In fact, as investigators later found, Epstein spoke with a female friend during this roughly 15-minute unmonitored call. After finishing, he was returned to his cell at approximately 8 p.m., now completely alone. Overnight, the critical safety measures that should have protected Epstein utterly failed. The 2 correctional officers assigned to the SHU for the overnight midnight shift of August 9th to 10th did not perform their required rounds or inmate counts for that entire night. They were supposed to check each inmate at least twice an hour and formally count the prisoners at regular intervals. Instead, by all evidence, the officers on duty neglected to tour the SHU units after about 10:40 p.m, and even skipped the standard head counts at 12 a.m, 3 a.m, and 5 a.m. Later investigations strongly suggested the guards were inactive or even asleep during the night. To cover up their dereliction, the officers falsified the official logs, recording bogus entries to indicate they had made their rounds when in reality no one looked in on Epstein or the other SU inmates for roughly 8 hours. Tragically, this lapse went undiscovered until it was too late. At around 6:30 a.m. on the morning of August 10th, 2019, the night shift officers, along with incoming day staff, began the routine task of delivering breakfast to the inmates in the SHU. As they opened the tier door and arrived at Epstein's cell, they received no reply to their routine morning wake-up knock. When the cell door was opened, officers discovered Epstein unresponsive, hanging from a makeshift noose fashioned out of an orange bedding cloth tied to the top bunk of his bed. The 66-year-old had apparently taken his own life in the middle of the night. The officers cut Epstein down and initiated CPR while sounding the alarm for medical assistance. EMS responders arrived and Epstein was transported by ambulance to a hospital, where he was officially pronounced dead at 7:36 a.m. Staff later found multiple nooses fashioned from torn sheets in Epstein's cell, evidence that he had prepared for his unalive in advance. Because of the earlier DVR failure, there was no recorded video of the interior of Epstein's housing area that night, only live monitoring, which had also lapsed. The FBI later analysed the malfunctioning camera system and confirmed that no footage existed of the critical period due to the July 29th hardware crash. On August 16, 2019, the New York City Medical Examiner announced the official determination that Epstein's death was unalive by hanging with no signs of foul play. Custody and care prior to Epstein's death. The OIG's findings detail how MCC New York managed and mismanaged Epstein's incarceration in the weeks leading up to his death. Initially, after his July 6, 2019 arrest, Epstein's intake and early days proceeded normally. He was placed in the special housing unit both for his own protection and due to the notoriety of his case, and he was assigned a cellmate. In his first week, Epstein underwent medical and psychological evaluations. He denied having unalive thoughts or any mental health history, and staff noted several protective factors. For example, he expressed a negative view of unalive and optimism about the future. Indeed, Epstein told a psychologist on July 10th that he was looking forward to his upcoming court hearing and believed he would be released on bail. He did, however, complain about certain conditions in the SHU. He asked to be single-celled, without a roommate, requested more drinking water and his personal belongings, and said he disliked having to wear the SHU's orange jumpsuit. The MCC's chief psychologist explained the reasons for these restrictions and provided Epstein with coping strategies to manage his stress, which Epstein appeared to accept. Overall, during these first 2 weeks, the OIG found that Epstein seemed calm and stable, ate his meals, slept normally, and socialized with his cellmate, showing no immediate warning signs of self-harm. That changed on July 23, 2019, when Epstein was discovered in his SHU cell with a strip of bedsheet around his neck, in what was presumed to be a unalive attempt. He was found in time and treated for only minor injuries, red abrasions on his neck. But the incident was a turning point. MCC officials promptly placed Epstein on unalive watch, an intensive precaution in which a potentially unalival inmate is kept under constant observation by specially trained staff. Epstein was moved to a cell near the medical unit and kept under 24-hour monitoring. In the hours after the incident, Epstein first alleged that his cellmate had tried to kill him. However, he soon retracted that claim and said he couldn't remember what happened. Medical and psychological staff assessed Epstein and noted the neck injury, but found no other acute medical issues. After about 24 hours, the BOP's psychology department determined that Epstein's risk had lowered enough to discontinue the unalive watch, which is meant for imminent threats. On July 24th, Epstein was downgraded to psychological observation, a step-down status where he remained in the infirmary area under less constant, but still frequent, supervision by mental health staff. He was cooperative and continued to deny any intent to harm himself. For nearly a week, until July 30th, psychologists met with Epstein daily and documented that he consistently refuted having unalive thoughts or plans. After several days of stability on observation, MCC officials decided to return Epstein to the SHU. On July 30th, he was moved back to a regular SHU cell, this time with special precautions in place. Notably, the prison's chief psychologist issued a written directive on July 30th stating that Epstein needs to be housed with an appropriate cellmate at all times going forward. This instruction was communicated to over 70 MCC staff by email and was intended to ensure that Epstein would not be left alone in a cell, given his recent unalive attempt. Consistent with that guidance, Epstein was assigned a new cellmate immediately upon his return to the SHU. According to the OIG, the MCC New York leadership chose a cellmate for Epstein, whom they deemed suitable and unlikely to harm him. In addition, staff were expected to keep a closer watch on Epstein's mood and behaviour. During the next week and into early August 2019, Epstein's daily routine resumed, and he showed no overt signs of unalival behaviour. He shared a cell with his new cellmate and continued to meet frequently with his attorneys to prepare his defence. Psychology staff continued to check on him. For example, a clinical psychologist saw him on August 1st for a follow-up, during which Epstein again denied having any unalival ideation. By all accounts, Epstein appeared relatively upbeat about his legal prospects and did not voice any desire to self-harm. The OIG notes that in these final days, jail officials were complying with Epstein's mandated care on paper. He had a cellmate and was receiving mental health attention, but this period was essentially the calm before a storm of failures. As detailed in the next section of the report, multiple safeguard measures put in place for Epstein would collapse on the night of August 9th to 10th, with fatal consequences. The events of August 8th to 10th, 2019, and Epstein's death. The report's most damning findings detail the final 48 hours of Epstein's life, when a cascade of procedural failures at MCC New York culminated in his unalive. On August 8th, 2019, 2 days before his death, Epstein spent much of the day with his attorneys. During one of these meetings, he signed a new last will and testament, effectively reassigning his assets. Critically, this action went unnoticed by jail staff at the time. It was an indication that Epstein may have been preparing for a possible end. But MCC personnel did not learn of the new will until after he was gone. The next day, August 9th, began with a breach of the safeguards that had been put in place for Epstein. In the morning, Epstein's cellmate was transferred out of the institution, and MCC staff failed to assign him a new cellmate in spite of the explicit directive that Epstein should never be left alone in a cell. As the OIG later noted, this was one of the most egregious lapses. By that night, Epstein, an inmate at high risk for self-harm, was housed alone, directly contravening the orders of psychological staff. Throughout August 9th, Epstein continued his routine of meeting with his lawyers and did not exhibit any obvious distress. However, that evening another improper exception was made for him. A supervising staff member allowed Epstein to make an unrecorded and unmonitored personal telephone call. This call, which Epstein claimed was to his family, violated BOP policy. In the SHU, social calls are ordinarily not permitted or are closely monitored. Nonetheless, Epstein was permitted to speak freely on the phone with an outside party on the last night of his life. After finishing the call, he was returned to his cell, now alone, at approximately 8 p.m. Overnight on August 9th to 10th, 2019, the 2 MCC officers assigned to watch the SHU, including Epstein's unit, completely failed in their duties. They did not perform the standard inmate count at 10 p.m. on August 9th, nor any of the required counts during the overnight hours. They also neglected to carry out the 30-minute rounds that were supposed to occur twice an hour to check on each inmate's well-being. Instead, evidence showed that both officers were inattentive. Reportedly, they spent substantial portions of the night browsing the internet or even fell asleep at their post. To cover up this dereliction, the officers falsified the prison logs, writing down phony entries to indicate they had made the requisite counts and rounds, when in fact no checks were done for approximately 8 hours. Compounding these failures, the guards had allowed Epstein to accumulate an excessive amount of bed linens and clothing in his cell. Epstein used those extra materials to fashion a noose. Left entirely unmonitored and alone, he had both the means and the opportunity to take his own life. At around 6:30 a.m. on the morning of August 10th, 2019, MCC staff discovered Epstein hanging in his SIU cell during the morning inmate count and breakfast delivery. A strip of orange sheet was tied to the top bunk of his bed and looped around Epstein's neck. Responding staff cut him down and initiated emergency life-saving measures. An ambulance was summoned and Epstein was transported to a hospital in Lower Manhattan. At 7:36 a.m., he was pronounced dead. A later search of Epstein's cell revealed multiple knotted strips of sheet, additional nooses among the excess linens, indicating that he had prepared for the attempt in advance. In the aftermath, investigators confirmed that no surveillance video existed of the interior of the SHU range during the relevant hours due to the previously identified camera system failure. However, based on the electronic door records, the testimony of other inmates, and the limited hallway footage available, the FBI and OIG found no evidence of any other person entering Epstein's area that night. The New York City Medical Examiner's autopsy likewise concluded that Epstein's injuries were consistent with unalive, and that there were no signs of a physical altercation, ruling his death unalive by hanging. The OIG characterized the events of August 9th through 10th as a perfect storm of incompetence, misconduct, and managerial failures that enabled Epstein to evade every security measure that should have protected him. This chapter of the report lays out how virtually every safeguard, a cellmate, regular guard rounds, functional security cameras, and diligent supervision was absent or breached on the final night of Epstein's life. These factual findings underscore the extent to which MCC New York's staff failed in their duty, directly contributing to one of the most high-profile custodial deaths in modern BOP history. Chapter 6 of the report examines why there was so little security camera footage available of the critical events, and reveals a major technical failure in MCC New York's surveillance system. Unbeknownst to staff at the time, on July 29, 2019, about 2 weeks before Epstein's death, one of the institution's digital video recorders, known as DVR2, crashed due to a hardware failure. This DVR was responsible for recording video from roughly half of MCC's security cameras, including the SHU where Epstein was housed. As a result of the July 29th failure, those cameras continued to function, providing live feeds, but were no longer recording or saving any footage. Astonishingly, MCC New York staff did not realize that their camera system had lost its recording capability until August 8th, when they finally discovered the malfunction, at which point Epstein's final days were already unfolding. Although replacement hard drives were obtained in an attempt to fix the system, the repair had not been completed by the time of Epstein's death. This lapse had serious consequences for the investigation of Epstein's death. When OIG and FBI investigators later sought video evidence of what transpired in Epstein's unit on the night of August 9th to 10th, they found that no recordings existed. Immediately after discovering Epstein's body on August 10th, MCC staff had futilely attempted to locate video footage, only to realise that the SAU cameras had not been recording at all. The FBI subsequently seized the hard drives from the DVR system and performed a forensic analysis, which confirmed that the system had experienced catastrophic disk failures and that no video was captured in the SAU after July 29, 2019. In the end, the only surveillance images of Epstein's unit from the night of his death came from a single live view hallway camera and door motion logs, neither of which showed anything amiss. The lack of recorded video fueled speculation and made it harder to conclusively rule out foul play, though, as noted, all other evidence pointed to Epstein's unalive. The OIG used this incident to underscore a broader systemic issue: outdated and unreliable security camera systems in federal prisons. In fact, MCC New York's camera system was already slated for an upgrade prior to Epstein's death. But progress on that project had been slow, hampered by staffing shortages and other delays. The OIG pointed out that across the Bureau of Prisons, many facilities have faced similar problems. In 2016, the OIG and Department of Justice warned that dozens of prisons had inadequate or non-functional camera coverage. The Bureau eventually identified 45 of its 122 institutions, including MCC New York, that required security camera improvements, and those upgrades were still in progress as of 2019. The report emphasizes that a functional camera system with recording capability is not a luxury, but a basic necessity for prison security and accountability. Because MCC New York lacked a working recording system, it effectively blacked out the key moments of Epstein's unalive, depriving investigators and the public of a complete visual record of what happened. In its recommendations, the OIG called for the BOP to address these deficiencies head-on. One of the report's final recommendations was that the Bureau enhance its policies regarding institutional security camera systems to ensure that cameras have recording capability and that regular checks are conducted to verify they are functioning properly. In response, BOP agreed that modernizing its surveillance infrastructure is a priority. The camera failure that left Epstein's death shrouded in uncertainty thus became a catalyst for long overdue reforms to prevent such critical blind spots in the future. Conclusions and recommendations. In its final chapter, the report concludes that Jeffrey Epstein's death was not the result of a mysterious conspiracy, but rather a devastating failure of routine safeguards, many of which the OIG had warned about in prior reviews of the BOP. The combination of negligence, misconduct, and systemic weaknesses at MCC New York created a situation in which a high-profile inmate was able to take his own life in federal custody. The OIG stresses that this was not a one-off event. The lapses that occurred, from chronic staffing shortages to ignored security procedures and faulty equipment, mirrored long-standing problems the OIG has identified throughout the Bureau of Prisons. Epstein's case, in the OIG's view, epitomized these chronic issues, and the fallout effectively deprived his many victims of the opportunity to see justice served in the courtroom, while also fueling public distrust in the prison system. To address the multitude of failures, the OIG made a series of 8 recommendations to the BOP aimed at preventing anything like this from happening again. First, several recommendations focused on improving the care and monitoring of inmates at risk for unalive. The OIG urged the BOP to implement a formal process to ensure that when an inmate is taken off unalive watch, they are consistently assigned a cellmate, with any exceptions to this rule documented and justified. Relatedly, the OIG said that high-risk inmates who require a cellmate should never be left alone unless a qualified professional changes that assessment, and that the BOP should have contingency plans to promptly reassign cellmates if needed. The report also advised the BOP to standardise its procedures for social and legal visits for inmates on unalive watch or observation, to make sure that security is not compromised during those interactions, for example by requiring management approval and staff presence for any such visits. Next, the OIG addressed the general security and custody failures revealed by this case. It recommended that the Bureau strengthen how it accounts for inmates' whereabouts and well-being, meaning more robust inmate count procedures and supervisory rounds, and to make any policy or training changes necessary to ensure staff actually perform those duties. As part of this, the OIG specifically said the BOP should clarify the expectations for supervisory officers, like lieutenants, when conducting rounds, so that those rounds are meaningful and not just a paperwork formality. The report also highlighted the need for better searches of inmate cells and removal of potential hazards after finding that MCC New York had been lax in this regard. Another critical recommendation was that the BOP continue to develop and implement strategies to alleviate chronic staffing shortages at its facilities. The OIG noted that inadequate staffing, which often leads to overtime fatigue and use of unqualified staff in security roles, was a key factor in the lapses at MCC New York, and it pressed the BOP to prioritise hiring and retention of correctional officers. Finally, the OIG called on the BOP to modernise its security infrastructure. It recommended upgrading institutional camera systems and explicitly requiring that all facilities have the capability to record and retain video with regular functionality checks to prevent the kind of blind spot that occurred at MCC New York. In essence, the OIG told the BOP to treat security cameras as mission-critical equipment and ensure they are always operable. The report's recommendations, taken together, were designed to address both the specific errors made in Epstein's case and the underlying systemic issues, from employee misconduct to outdated technology, that have plagued the Bureau. In response to the OIG's report, the BOP concurred with all 8 recommendations and began taking steps to implement them. The OIG also urged the BOP to review the conduct of all MCC New York staff involved in Epstein's custody and determine whether disciplinary or other action was appropriate in each case. Notably, by the time of the report, the 2 officers who skipped their rounds had already been criminally charged and later allowed to resign after admitting their falsifications. The report concludes by expressing hope that the lessons from Epstein's death, painful as they are, will spur meaningful reforms across the federal prison system. Only by addressing these failures, the OIG suggests, can the BOP restore public trust and ensure the safety of inmates in its care. We hope these quiet thoughts helped you drift a little closer to rest. Sleep well,